Good. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Alarm to Action webinar. I'm Julia Langer, CEO of the Atmospheric Fund, TAF as we're known. TAF is an endowment that invests in low carbon solutions for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, what we call the GTHA, and helps scale them up for broad implementation. TAF's core mandate is to follow the carbon. So we publish an annual inventory that measures the carbon emitted in the GTHA to help inform the direction and the speed of climate actions in the region. This year's report is a major reality check. It shows that since Ontario's coal phase out in 2014, it was completed in 2014, emissions are steadily increasing across the region, a very concerning 5.2% increase year over year in the latest data. Today, you'll hear the key findings from the report authors. That's the alarm, followed by 4 expert panelists who I'll introduce later with strategies for using data to influence and implement smart evidence-based decisions. That's the action part. I'd like to acknowledge now that the land I'm standing on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I know we have people participating from across Canada, and I urge you to also acknowledge the traditional territory on which you are standing. Some very quick logistics, although we're now all Zoom experts. So you can ask questions through the Q&A icon found at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Please be as specific as possible. And if someone has asked a great question, there's a function where you can vote it up rather than repeat it so that we see the most popular questions. Comments can go in the chat. And if you're having technical difficulties, please put that in the chat. Our team will assist you. So just remember, you may have to hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen to see the Q&A and chat functions. We'll get to as many questions as we can about the report, but we're saving 35 minutes for questions to our panelists. So lots of opportunity for Q&A, both technical and strategic. You are encouraged to share anything you're learning about or curious about or want to shout out about on social media at Atmospheric Fund. That will be in the chat, so you know where that is. Everyone who is registered for this webinar will get a copy of the slide presentation and a webinar recording. So without further ado, I will welcome TAF's VP for Policy and Programs, Brian Purcell, to share the findings of our report, Reality Check Carbon Emissions for the GTHA. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Julia. So today I'm going to be summarizing the results of our latest edition of our carbon emissions inventory for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. This edition covers data up to 2018 and is our 3rd edition. By necessity, inventories are always backwards looking because it takes some time to assemble data and undertake the analysis to report on where emissions are at. So the inventory is intended to help us inform our strategies and priorities in investing in climate action across the region, but it's also intended to guide future actions for stakeholders across the region as they plan their pathways to achieving their climate targets. The inventory covers scope 1 and 2 emissions, which basically means that it covers fuel that's combusted directly within the geographic boundaries of the region, as well as indirect emissions from electricity generation for the electricity that's imported into the region. It doesn't cover scope 3 emissions, which refers to, for example, the emissions associated with producing the products that we import into the region. Those emissions are certainly very important, and we may be able to include them in future editions, but they're not captured here. And it covers the Greater Toronto-Hamilton area. And you can see here the results at a high level when we look across that region. The single largest source, accounting for 43% of emissions, is buildings. And that's primarily from the direct use of natural gas for space and water heating. but also the use of electricity in homes and buildings as well. The second largest source, accounting for just over a third of the emissions profile, is transportation, mostly from personal vehicles, but also from commercial transportation sources. The third largest source is heavy industry, which accounts for just under 20% of emissions. And then the remaining sources are waste, solid waste, which accounts for about 3%, and agriculture, which accounts for just under 1% of total emissions. And the high level finding was that total emissions were 55.5 megatons across the region. That's an increase of 5.2% from the previous year, which is a very significant increase. Clearly, we're not on track for our 2030 and 2050 climate targets, especially when we consider that emissions increased not just in total across the GTHA, but emissions actually increased in each and every one of these 6 regions, and for all of the for the 2 largest sources of emissions. Next slide, please. So where are we and where do we need to be? This slide shows you emissions all the way back to 1990. And one thing that's immediately apparent is that between 2005 and 2014, we made rapid and sustained progress in reducing carbon emissions in the region. And that was primarily due to the phase out of coal-fired electricity, among other factors. But starting in 2015, emissions flatlined and began trending upward again, which is hugely concerning. While there's no single target for the entire region, each municipality has set their own targets. This shows you the 2050 target of net zero, which several municipalities have selected and is also the national commitment, and a 2030 target that's consistent with that pathway. And basically, in order to get onto that net zero by 2050 pathway, we need to be reducing emissions by over 7% each and every year. So in any year where we don't hit a 7% reduction, that means that each and every year in the future, we have to exceed that 7% reduction. So the 5% increase in the most recent year is extremely concerning for that reason, because it means each and every year now we have more work to do. Next slide, please. So where are the increases coming from? The single largest increase in tons was from the direct use of natural gas in homes and buildings, primarily for space and water heating. These increased by 11% in the year. Now, a big part of that increase was that 2018 had a colder winter than the previous year. And that means a larger demand for space heating, which is largely served by natural gas. But even when we normalize for weather, we saw that there was still a significant increase once we stripped out the impact of weather. And that's largely associated with the population growth in the region. More people coming to the region means more homes, more buildings, and therefore increased demand for energy primarily to heat those buildings. And that's a big factor in the trend towards increasing emissions we see. Next slide, please. Now, another source that increased was electricity generation. And in this case, the rate of increase was absolutely shocking. We saw a 57% year-over-year increase in emissions from electricity generation. Now, this is despite there wasn't a 50% increase in electricity consumption. In fact, there was just under a 5% increase in consumption, but that resulted in a 57% increase in emissions. That's because our electricity generation, the marginal source right now in Ontario is natural gas. So anytime there's an increase in consumption, it's going to be met by that natural gas generators, and those have a disproportionately large impact on emissions. This 57% increase is quite concerning. Electricity is still a relatively small share of the total emissions in the region, but based on the latest forecast from the IESO released in February this year, it's expected to increase by another 130% by 2030 and to double again by 2040. So the plan right now in Ontario is sustained and massive increases in emissions from generating electricity, which are creating a massive liability for our climate targets and climate plans. There's simply no way to reach those 2030 and 2050 targets without changing where we're headed on electricity generation in Ontario today. Next slide, please. Emissions from transportation also increased, although more modestly, about 1%. And this accounts for a little over a third of total emissions. But the challenging thing here is that we've seen transportation emissions consistently growing 1 to 2% each year across the region. And this is despite cleaner fuels and the average fuel efficiency getting better for each category of vehicles. Part of this is more vehicles on the road because of the growing population in the region, and also a consumer shift towards larger vehicles like SUVs and trucks. So as the trucks are getting more efficient and the cars are getting more efficient, but if demand shifts from cars to trucks, the real efficiency on the road is getting worse. So this sustained trend in increasing transportation emissions is also really concerning. Next slide. This gives you a picture of emission sources by municipality, so or the higher tier municipality. And you can see that in many ways, the emissions profiles are similar. What stands out is that Hamilton in particular has much higher industrial emissions, also to a lesser extent Durham and Peel. But you see that the major emission sources other than that are pretty consistent. Buildings, homes and buildings are a major source for every region. Transportation also very significant, and waste and agriculture being a more modest share of the total emissions. Next slide, please. So this gives you a better picture of where industrial emissions come from. The main source, the single largest source of industrial emissions in the region is steel production at almost half of the industrial emissions for the region. This is centered in Hamilton, and it's a big share of Hamilton's emissions profile. The next largest industrial source is cement production, primarily in Durham and Peel region, where there are significant cement plants and cement production. And that's a very significant source as well. And then the remaining 30% is a mix of other industries across the region. So these are big challenges because cement and steel production are very challenging to decarbonize, but they're also major opportunities because with dealing with really mainly 3 entities and 3 plants, there's opportunities to make massive gains in emissions reductions across the region. Next slide, please. So what is this data telling us about what the policy priorities are for achieving net zero by 2050? One thing that really stands out is the importance of getting all new construction to near zero emissions. I'm often told that we need to focus only on existing buildings because they're the majority of the building stock. But when you look at provincial population forecasts, we see the population for the Greater Toronto Hamilton area is expected to grow by 3 million people by 2050. That's equivalent to adding another Toronto into the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, or as another example, 3.5 Mississaugas being added to the region. So just think about that for a second and think about the physical impact of that much additional development in the region to make room for the population growth. If we can't get those new buildings and new homes to near zero emissions rapidly, then it's going to be impossible for any of the regions to hit their climate targets because we just simply can't retrofit enough existing buildings to keep up with the impact of all the new construction going on if those buildings are not near zero. So that's a critical area, and a lot of municipalities are leading the way on this with municipal green development standards. They're pushing the boundaries of new construction. We need to keep moving on that, as well as on the provincial building code and other ways of addressing this with new construction. Existing buildings are obviously a very big priority and the single largest source of emissions. And so that's about accelerating deep retrofits in existing buildings. Right now, that's primarily happening through voluntary programs and incentives, financing programs that many municipalities are starting to explore or offer. And there's going to need to be a transition to stronger policy tools over the coming years to get us on track for that, those deep emission reductions that we need to hit the 2030 and 2050 targets. And the final thing that stands out is the importance of clean electrification. It's so essential that we get our electricity supply on a trajectory towards zero emissions, because on the current trajectory, we'll have a massive increase in emissions from electricity generation, which will make our targets completely non-viable. But also, many of the most important technologies and strategies for reducing transportation and building emissions and industrial emissions require clean electricity. You know, electrifying heating through heat pumps, transportation through electric vehicles, and some of the strategies for decarbonizing industry rely on clean electricity as well, which is also a way to produce hydrogen, which is looked at there. So those are three critical policy priorities we see coming out of the data in the inventory. And next slide, please. So that covers the summary of the emissions inventory. I'm going to move to questions from the audience, and my colleagues, Miriam and Juan, will help manage those. I should add that Miriam and Juan were primarily responsible for the research and all the data and analysis that I've just presented.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Yes, now we have the bit of the data under our belt, and the report authors, Miriam Shakarasfard and Juan Sotes from TAF's Carbon and Co-Benefits team, will answer your questions. And these should be, you have to be putting these in the chat. So let me just get there. So why is the ISO increasing their GHG from electricity? Are they ramping up electricity production from natural gas? Is your emission factor report in the report projecting the increase over 20 years? It says, what is that factor? It says seems to be 130%. So maybe you can answer that bundle of questions about the electricity factors.
Yes, so ISO is forecasting an increase in natural gas generation, both because, as Brian said, our region is growing a lot and very fast, and also because we are going to go in the 2020s through a refurbishment process for some of our nuclear facilities, which will reduce the electricity output from nuclear, and also one of the main nuclear stations here in the GTHA, which is Pickering, is expected to close over the next 10 years, which will also generate a gap in generation that is expected to be met with natural gas, according to current plans. We hope that this is not the case.
Okay, I have a question here about building codes. Which building codes are used for most new construction? We need to aim for net zero and stretch the design criteria to be able to help reduce emissions. What are the plans in regard to new construction and modifications to the building stock? And from a quantification perspective, I mean, we'll get into some of the policy, but maybe address what impact that would make.
Well, again, this region is going to grow very fast. So having building codes that address low emissions or even zero emissions for new constructions is critical to achieve our targets. We don't get to model any pathway to net zero without having very, very ambitious plans for new constructions.
Great, thanks, Juan. I have a question about scope 3. It seems that scope 3 emissions would be a very large component in overall emissions for the GTHA and should be estimated so they can help inform the need for urgent action. For example, airline emissions at airports. Will this be possible in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that we are looking into to include some of the aviation emissions in the next inventory. Considering that we perceive quite a large emissions emitted from our person emissions, the airport and delivery shop. So this is something that we definitely are looking into it for the next year inventory, and the other also scope 3 emissions such as fugitive emission laws. We are thinking of including that as well in next year inventory.
Right, and in terms of maybe contributing to the conversation here, to the various participants in the chat, if you're working on Scope 3 emissions, we'd certainly like to hear from you, because this is an emerging area of practice. The protocols are not exactly, refined, although there's been a fair amount of work on this. So it's something where Miriam and Juan and a broader community of practice could benefit from.
Absolutely. To your point, we are looking forward to receive, the Durham region. We know that they're working on the Scope 3 emissions coming out this year, 2021. So it should be very helpful.
Okay. Good. So just a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. So just so we can differentiate, some of the information items and some of the questions for the report authors. So question from David: how is the growth of the real estate being taken into account, given the existing buildings that will be here for many years? How do we get deep retrofits that take longer term payback than the real estate? I guess the meaning is the differentiation. Maybe I'll paraphrase the differentiation between impact on new construction and in retrofits from a quantitative emission perspective.
Yeah, when I guess this is related to the forecasting emissions. We are assuming that the current green standards are in place and not more ambitious, that we expect that happen in the next 2 years. And we also are modeling for our business as usual a low level of retrofits for the current building stock, which also we know that are not going to be enough to get where we want to be.
Great. So how are commuting emissions assigned? The Hamilton transportation emissions seem low by comparison, despite 40% of commuters.
We for transportation emissions, we took into account the fuel sales emission, gasoline and diesel fuel sales emissions, and we basically really not consider the commuting from each city to another, but we actually compared this result with the Google EIE, which actually track every single car and all those commutes, and with adjusting for some of the factors for EIE transport emissions, we've seen that the results are pretty much in the ballpark and comparable. And also, this is something that we are looking to collaborate with Clean Air Partnership to buy the Ministry of Transport data, odometer data at postal code level to be able to really better understand the transport emission at commute level. So
great. Well, thank you, Miriam and Juan. And while you didn't do it, I will put in a plug for an initiative that the team has developed over the past couple of years called the Carbon Data Network. And really, this is recognizing that these methodologies are, some of them are standard, some of them need to be developed. And so some of these questions that you have put into, have thrown at the report authors are things that we wrestle with together with stakeholders who actually are interested in quantification as well. So we can put more information about the Carbon Data Network and make that available. It's through, we publicize it a lot through our blog. So we don't have time for all the great questions. So I need to move us on to the next exciting part of our program. But we'll encourage you to follow up with any further questions through the chat, and we'll make our best attempts to respond. So we have 4 amazing panelists to bring us diverse and equally important angles on the climate action conversation. So please join me in welcoming Adriane Carr, She's a 3-term City of Vancouver councillor and chair of the Metro Vancouver Climate Action Committee, and she's also the city's representative for C40 Women for Climate. Jade Shofield, the town of Whitby's project manager for sustainability and climate change. Sarah Buchanan, Ontario Climate Program Manager with Environmental Defence, and Akua Schatz, Vice President, Market Engagement and Advocacy for Canada Green Building Council. So thank you for joining us for this webinar. And I'm going to start off the conversation and the discussion with a question for each of our panelists. And first for you, Adriane, as chair of the Metro Vancouver Climate Action Committee, you've been an integral part of developing Vancouver's ambitious climate energy action plan, and prior to that, the Vancouver Climate Emergency Resolution. Here in the GTHA, we've certainly been inspired by the level of ambition and the tools that you've been using, including mobility pricing and emission limits for buildings and EV charging rollout. So what's your secret sauce? What's your advice for how cities in Canada can drive change faster?
That's a great question, Julia. You know, I think it's the sauce. Okay, if I'm thinking of ingredients, I'd say it's political leadership, staff leadership, whatever jurisdiction you're working in, public leadership, and money. And if you don't have those 4 things, you get stalled out. So let's go into a little bit of depth on that. Political leadership, you know, Vision was a party that it's not really in right now. We have political parties. We're in an at-large system in Vancouver. And so no wards, it's very different from what you have in Toronto. But anyway, when you get a majority party, it's like a majority government at the city level. And Vision did bring in the Greenest City Action Plan, aiming to be the greenest city in the world. Ambitious, and it drove a lot of that initial change, focusing particularly on the sort of big, bold moves right off the bat. One of them was capturing the methane from our landfill. And probably everyone on this call knows, I mean, methane is what, 84 times more potent than CO2 in the first 20 years of its deterioration. So it's really important to get at methane. And the second was to put in a district energy system in the central part of Vancouver, capturing heat from effluent in the pipes. So I think that's really critical. But it's also critical to kind of be honest where you're making mistakes. As politicians, sometimes we don't want to do that, but you have to. You have to, for example, once I got elected in 2011, 1 year after that plan started, I noticed right off the bat that the housing program, they said, should achieve a LEED Gold standard. And I looked up LEED Gold, and I knew it from forestry. What is it for housing? And you don't even have to really reduce energy much and still get a LEED Gold standard if you source things locally and have good labor, blah, blah, blah. So you have to really look hard at the tools that you're using, the targets and the processes. Second, staff leadership, man, they come up with the plans. The most important thing is for me that they have the plan, they have measurables on an actual incremental basis, year by year. We were missing our targets on the Greenest City Action Plan, which was the start to our climate action plan, because I think because we had a 10-year target. You know, it was a 30% reduction by 2020, and we weren't getting there because every year we weren't hearing just how much they're coming down and making changes on that interim basis. So course corrections, public leadership. Where would we be without the IPCC? Just think about that. There is a leadership of the scientists that help provide the legitimacy for the work we do. I love the IPCC. And when they came out in 2018 saying we got to ramp it up, we became one of the first cities to actually declare a climate emergency. And I don't know, I'm 1,500 cities or whatever it is now. It really helps inspire the staff to make bolder plans. Private sector, Where would we be without private sector? We need the Elon Musks to develop the engines. We've got, you know, a producer of hydrogen fuel cells in Vancouver, which are going to be critical in the transportation sector. The film sector in Vancouver has been really bold. I did a motion with them. They absolutely wanted to get off diesel generators. We figured out if they got off their diesel generators, it inspired so many people. We decided all the food trucks will come off, all the diesel generators would be gone within the city. We'd replace them with power drops. And so, you know, that, and we're a bit easier in Vancouver because we have like 94% of our electricity is from hydro, unlike Ontario. So it's easier to get your drop in GHGs that way. And finally, the public, in terms of public leadership, absolutely inspired by youth, the sustainability teens. I love them. They are the most, and when they come to speak to council and they say to council and staff, I thought I would get married and have children. I don't think there's a future for children. So I'm not going to, it just tears at your heart. So I don't know if we would be as bold if we didn't have active leadership there. And finally, money. We can't do it alone at the civic level. As you know, we get 10% of the tax dollars at the civic level. So partnerships with the federal and the provincial governments are absolutely critical. I really hope they move on sort of nationally supporting building retrofits, enabling PACE financing, the property assessed financing, so that people don't have to put out of pocket money into retrofitting their buildings. They can borrow that money. It goes against their title. They just pay their energy bill at the same amount as an energy bill would normally be. And, 50% of the buildings currently standing will still be standing at 2050, and we have to be at net zero by 2050. So I see that as a huge challenge. Anyway, those are the 4 things I think we need.
Fantastic. Well, you gave us a lot to think about, and a checklist to go for. So some of this might resonate. Jade, over to you. Whitby managed to adopt a very ambitious new building standard at a time when cities have many other pressing priorities and even opposition. How did the Green Development Standard connect to Whitby's broader priorities, maybe referencing some of the things that Adriane talked about, and how important were those connections to advancing the policy?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you, to Julia, for having me today. I'm really excited to be sharing with you the experience we had with the Whitby Green Standard. And when it comes to connecting broader priorities, I think one thing that resonates with a lot of us is the climate change emergency. For Whitby, we were the first in Durham region to declare climate change an emergency back in June 2019. And this really did start as a time where we've been talking about climate change and sustainability for probably 10 plus years, but now the rubber was actually starting to hit the road and actions were starting to happen. The climate change emergency elevated our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, the 2050 goals that we had in place. And it really elevated some of the work we had done in the early 2010s around sustainable communities, ensuring that we're addressing all 3 pillars of sustainability: the economy, the social aspects, as well as the natural environment. In terms of connecting those kind of sustainability and climate change priorities with other conflicting sometimes challenges that we have as a municipality, this actually became an opportunity for us. Whitby's population is set to grow an additional 40% in 11 years. That's incredible growth. And it actually begs to say that we need to address sustainability and climate action now in order to ensure all of those homes are ready for those impacts that we're set to see in the near future. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to do this, our climate goals need to be integrated into our new development planning processes. So when it comes to alignment of priorities, the town of Whitby took a unique approach through the Whitby Green Standard. It follows a One Living Planet framework. So it isn't just about climate change. It isn't just about energy. We are ensuring that all themes of sustainability are addressed in all new development, with a particular focus on low-rise residential, because that is what we are seeing the majority of new development taking place in our community. This tool is a roadmap. It encourages all new development to move towards net zero by 2032. So rather than just having a policy in place now, we are outlining where we need to be in alignment to those climate goals. And one thing I think echo Councillor Carr's comments around having an ability to track sustainability performance. The Whitby Green Standard not only acts as an incentive and a celebration tool, but it allows staff to track sustainability performance and celebrate those who are advancing innovative design criteria above and beyond the norm. And hopefully that will help encourage this to be the norm. And then there's some softer benefits in terms of alignment of priorities, thinking about how green standards actually help streamline the planning and development process. It brings planners, public works staff, parks planners, sustainability staff, all into one tool so that we can share and learn and expand our understanding and awareness of the complexities of sustainable and climate change performance. And this is really important because sustainability staff cannot fight this alone. One councillor can't fight this alone. We need to work together. We need to work with those that may not be on board right now, focus on that education, ongoing engagement, and ensuring that we are all learning together. And then to summarize, connections to advancing policy, the Whitby Green Standard would not have been possible if it wasn't from the incredible support from our community. Councillor Carr turned the coin, sustainability teams. They came out, they did delegations to council supporting a green standard. Probably not a topic, low-rise residential development is one that they think about every day, but through the climate emergency, this has drawn up incredible community support. We couldn't have done it without professional organizations, including TAF, the Clean Air Partnership, the Canada Green Building Council, who outlined the science and the backing behind what it is that we were trying to do. And of course, our amazing consultants who worked tirelessly with staff and our stakeholders. So thank you, Urban Equation and the Planning Partnership, who I believe are listening in today. And then of course, council and staff support. You cannot do any initiative like this as a one solo staff member. You need the buy-in from your entire organization, and they were absolutely phenomenal. But our next steps, we don't stop there. Our next steps are to share our successes. We want to experience the challenges as we begin implementation and continue to advance so that we do meet those climate change goals.
Thanks, Jade. Well, I think this whole sort of turning opposition to opportunity and track and celebrate is kind of another little mantra checklist that we've got for today. So Sarah, I had a question for you because environmental defense campaigns are really moving the dial on public opinion these days in support of climate action. And could you please share with us how the emissions data, which is kind of the theme of our webinar, can be better used to influence decisions and get better outcomes?
Well, thank you for that very flattering introduction, Julia. It's much appreciated. And I have to say, in the climate work that I've done in Ontario, particularly in the last few years, having access to good, reliable emissions data has been critical in tracking climate change progress and also in holding governments accountable for the promises that they're making on climate change. So, we know that lots of governments at all levels, municipal governments, regional governments, provincial, federal, have declared climate emergencies. And there's been a huge outpouring of energy and a groundswell to make that happen. But the next step is to look at, are there plans that came out of these emergencies in many cases effective? Where are they effective? How are they effective? Where are emissions going up? Are they going up in transportation, home heating from fossil gas, as we've seen in TAF's report? Why are they going up? And many of the jurisdictions who have declared climate emergencies are asking these questions. I think Vancouver is probably a good example, but some frankly aren't yet. So it's up to groups like us to often to go in and point this out, and many other groups alongside us as well. So I'll just give a quick example of how TAF's new inventory, which you just heard about, has already helped move the needle and move the dial on public opinion. It came out recently, and it came out right in the middle of a campaign that I'm very involved in right now to stop the proposed 413 highway from being built in Ontario. And I was preparing a presentation to Peel Regional Council on why their support for the highway actually undermined their promises to cut emissions and fight climate change when Peel has in fact declared a climate emergency. And to bring to that presentation, I had TAF's data, and that showed that emissions in the GTHA and in Peel region had gone up in 2018. And I also had data, which was also supported by TAF, fresh from some modeling we just did, to look at what the actual carbon footprint of the vehicles on the proposed Highway 413 would be. So then standing in front of these decision makers with both of these pieces of data in hand, I could conclusively say that, you know, Peel does need to step it up, to do more to keep their climate promises. Although Peel is, I have to say, Peel is doing quite a lot and has some great climate plans in the works. But Peel needs to do even more to keep their climate promises. You know, we can't continue to coast on previous huge moves like the coal ban. We need to start thinking about big infrastructure projects that are planned, like highways. And here we have a decision right now that this council could make to make a difference and oppose a project that would make this problem worse and would increase greenhouse gas emissions. And there were many other deputants, I should say, pointing out this climate commitment. There were youth groups, local farmers, many others. And in the end, they did vote to oppose the highway and asked to look at alternatives as well. So, you know, when we look at what the emissions data is showing, what sectors are rising or falling and why, asking the question, what should we do to hit the targets that, you know, your jurisdiction has set out? That's a very important question. But often the question, what should we not do? What should we pull back from doing is even more important and sometimes not asked. So many of these big infrastructure projects like highways could blow these targets out of the water if we don't imagine better alternatives and start to shift to a different path in order to take these climate emergency declarations really, really seriously. So our role has simply been to try to take, you know, these very tangible, real emissions facts and turn them into that action at many levels of government.
Very interesting. Makes I'm building a checklist, and what you one of the next piece on that is what you don't do is equally as important as what you do. Thanks for that. So Akua, last but not least, we work a lot with Canada Green Building Council. You and your Cross Canada team are working very hard advocating for greening the building industry and preparing for a major green building revolution. So, as you saw from questions about the report, there was a lot of questions about the information, the data, and how we see the building sector, both the new construction and the retrofit side. So, what strategies are needed to drive growth in the green building sector at the kind of pace and scale needed to get all buildings to near zero carbon?
Great, thanks, Julia. Really interesting listening into all the conversations and reading the questions and comments too. Really building off of what Brian mentioned, where the focus is on retrofits, new construction, and electrification. Those are sort of the foundational pillars. New construction, I would only add that we also need to not only be driving towards zero carbon, so all new buildings built to zero carbon, but including embodied carbon as a critical element in our decision making around that. I'd say the scale piece is really what's driving my response to this, because we actually do have a lot of the tactical and technical information that we need to drive down emissions in buildings. But the scale piece is a different perspective to take. So when I'm looking at, there's some hope that's on the horizon that I see, especially accumulating over this last year through COVID. We've seen both government action as well as private sector action that's been somewhat unprecedented. So the fall economic statement, the throne speech, the updated climate plan, the investment announcements from the Canada Infrastructure Bank all reinforce the direction of a green recovery, and point to some key regulatory levers like the Accountability Act, increases in the carbon tax that are going to be instrumental in driving change. But we're also seeing the largest lenders and investors raising alarms about climate change and coming to the table with commitments of their own. So, you know, that tipping point started with Blackstone, but you now have sort of Barclays, HSBC, JP Morgan, and now when you look to Canada, you see of the 5 top banks, TD which is the second largest, was the first to announce a net zero commitment, and BMO was soon to follow. So these are essential to seeing the radical, and I would say speedy increase in pressures to drive down emissions. But when we look maybe at our own industry and some of the things that we should be focusing on, I'd say there are 4 key things. One of them is to drive aggregation. Our industry is currently really focused on models that look at a building by building approach rather than at a portfolio level. This means that large owners, REITs, pension funds, utilities, and local governments are in a position to help to drive down decarbonization en masse as they look at their suite of buildings and homes under their purview. We also need to sort of standardize requirements. Right now, you know, buildings are these unique snowflakes, and this inhibits the opportunity for aggregation, and it also increases risk levels for lenders and owners. So we need systems that not only standardize project development, like the Investor Confidence Project, but also standardize performance measurements. So things like operations and maintenance, monitoring and verification, benchmarking across all buildings. What also needs to happen is, you know, we are the Canada Green Building Council, and what we're trying to do is ensure that essentially all buildings are green, so that this is energy efficiency programs are not just these sidelined separate initiatives, but rather energy efficiency requirements are integrated into all types of building upgrades or developments, so that you know, when you're a local government is undertaking, you know, upgrades to kitchen facilities or introducing better accessibility features, that energy efficiency requirements are part of that package as well. And then maybe lastly, I'd focus on, we still have a siloed approach to this. So the partnership element is critical. And the workforce upskilling and reskilling is a good example of that. We need to ensure that we have the people power to service this low carbon economy. Workforce 2030 in Ontario is a coalition of about 50 organizations representing labor unions, educators, developers, owners, industry associations that are pushing for a low carbon workforce. And that's critical that we have these, that these partnerships are nurtured and sustained, because it's not just about increasing the number of individuals working in green building, but fully mainstreaming the skills needed across all disciplines to deliver on our climate change commitments.
Great, thank you, Akua. Really good practical list as well. All of you have been really thoughtful in terms of giving us sort of bite-sized pieces on this agenda. So I have a few questions to throw at you, panelists. So a question for Jade primarily, but if others have any perspectives. How was changes to the Planning Act or other recent policy change leveraged to move forward with your green development standard? Was legal involved, and what role did they play?
A great question, and one actually I've been hearing fairly commonly since the implementation of the Green Standard. And this one thing is I want to stress today is a bit of myth debusting. So municipalities have always had the authority to implement green development standards. This is not anything that is new or unique as a result of recent changes to the Planning Act or the Municipal Act. There's often a little bit of misinformation out there that originally only the City of Toronto had this authority. The way that the green development standards are actually enacted is through your site plan control bylaw. So for the municipal people out there, if your community is completely under a site plan control bylaw, you have the authority to direct and implement green development standards. One of the limitations is, of course, around the Ontario Building Code. No one has the ability to prescribe or mandate above, but we can certainly encourage and influence and incentivize to build above and beyond building code. And that's what the sole purpose of those green development standards are, is to incentivize and encourage building above the norm. From a legal perspective, we really are fortunate. Our town solicitor is absolutely phenomenal and was very supportive through the entire process of creating green development standards. We certainly did come across some legal challenges from some of the stakeholder communities, and our legal team worked directly not only with the stakeholders but with us as staff to make sure what we were doing was legal. And by having that ongoing correspondence throughout the whole process of the green standard development is certainly helpful. I also want to mention that leveraging the work off of other municipalities was also critical for understanding our authorities around implementing green standards. So Tony, for example, from Vaughan and Brampton and Richmond Hill and Toronto, like working with those staff and hearing their experiences certainly helped us de-risk and feel more comfortable with moving forward with this process.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll just add that all of us have been very inspired by the BC STEP Code and a lot of the work that's happened in Vancouver and elsewhere. Just, I think that the leveraging up and sort of building on the shoulders of the leaders in the space has really made a difference. So Akua, question for you about where is the green building industry on deconstruction and the circular economy? So some large demolition projects happening in our region. Obviously there's embedded carbon and there's emissions associated with demolition, et cetera. Any sort of perspectives to share?
You know, it's really interesting. It's the one area that I continue to hear about increasingly. Probably it might be a hot topic for 2021. It seems to be emerging increasingly in discussions around the circular economy and the role that deconstruction and repurposing building materials can play, especially not only as we're looking to new construction, but especially this wider expansive use of retrofits. I would say there are some standards from the CSA that actually in early days, back in 2006, I believe, put out some recommendations on pathways of how to approach repurposing materials. But other initiatives, primarily I believe like through Delphi Group, are starting to look more closely as how that applies to buildings and offer recommendations on what we can do to leverage this in our own code at the code level. But I would say the information is still emerging. So one to watch for this coming year.
Maybe we have to toss that over to Miriam and Juan to sort of get into their sort of protocol, the list of how do we have a protocol for good data generation on this as well. Great. So there's a question for all the panelists, actually. great sort of complementing the panel, great people advocating climate action, holding us to account on targets. What type of data and in what form is most powerful for assisting you in communicating the necessary decision options? How might we combine GHG emission data, other data like economic and social data to create even more powerful presentations and presumably outcomes? So why don't I mix it up, and Sarah?
Sure, you could tell I was just chomping at the bit to jump in on that one. And I want to thank Helen Doyle, who actually just jumped in on the chat here, for reminding me of a project we worked on really closely together. And that it might be an example of a way that, you know, we created some data that was, we felt more impactful and useful, or kind of raised the bar in terms of being able to understand that data a little bit better, and it was also supported by TAF, so thank you very much. And this basically took air pollution data from vehicle traffic in the GTHA, as well as greenhouse gas emissions data from those vehicles, and translated that air pollution into actual health impacts. So what kind of rise in premature deaths would we be looking at in each region, with different scenarios of vehicles and what kind of pollution they would be putting out. And so it helped paint a picture that was more than numbers. It was things like asthma, childhood bronchitis, and spoke to people, I think, in a way that resonated more deeply, because it was about their health or their children's health. Another example of great data, there's a study I go back to often that was from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and they examined basically the carbon footprint of Canadians by wealth indicators, and their main conclusion was simply that the richest 20% of Canadian income earners are responsible for almost double the greenhouse gas emissions of those in the lowest income group. And that's always stuck with me as not just a piece of data, but like a very powerful social comment as well. So data that takes into account a lot of those indicators and social factors can also help start those discussions and talk about inequality and all those incredibly complex and difficult things that need to be talked about.
Right. So Adriane, we're running out of time. I was just gonna give you a moment, because you've talked about, how we sort of bring all these pieces together.
Right. So first of all, it's been fascinating listening to everyone. It really is. And, we maybe have some leadership, but we've got a long ways to go. And just to correct one thing, the BC Building Code, our STEP code, actually has its problems because it's not tied to actual GHGs. It's energy efficiency. So make sure in all your codes, you're very clear that GHG reduction and benchmarking is a part of what you do. And we're now starting to move our push. I was on a UBCM special committee on this, pushing the government for a retrofit code that gets us to net zero. So I think those two codes might be needed. But truly, I love the bringing in of the health impacts. When you want to get public on board and various levels of government, I think being embracive of the multiple benefits. I mean, it's not just now, it is for our future generations. It is for our children and family, people who are the most vulnerable, who can't get away from the air, poor air quality, which, by the way, heat pumps are a great solution for, in terms of not only replacing gas, but they filter the air and thus within a home or building create a safer and healthier environment. So I think being holistic in the approach to public and other levels of government is critical.
Thank you so much. Well, I hope you noticed that the name of our team is Carbon and Co-Benefits Quantification. So we're certainly on board with that sentiment. Colleagues, that is all the time that we have for this webinar. Thank you so much for participating, and thank you to our panelists for volunteering their time and expertise. I don't think I can add any value, nor would I possibly attempt to summarize what we've heard today, with the one exception of reinforcing how important it is to have good information. But information alone does not change anything. It needs to be used to guide our actions and to determine if our actions are having impact. Hope I got that sort of in one sentence. The TAF contact details have been made available to you if you'd like to follow up with questions or any feedback. I would really encourage you all to stay up to date with TAF's climate action work by going to taf.ca, the subscribe button, or following us on Twitter and LinkedIn. And with that, thank you again. Have a great day, everybody.